Slowly, I became aware of my surroundings again as my thoughts began to emerge from the fog in my mind. The ominous semi-darkness of my basement workshop, lit only by the light from the partially open door, reflected my mood. One of my rackets that I had been working on earlier was still locked into a vise on the workbench. I could hear the sounds of our two youngest children on the other side of the partition wall, playing in the rec room and watching a Disney movie on the VCR. As I sat there in my old beat-up lounger, I glanced up at the clock on the wall. I had been sitting there for over a half hour, my thoughts spinning in circles, unmoving and unseeing, trying to understand what I wished I hadn't heard. Sunday evening dinner was over. My wife, Sally, was cleaning up the kitchen and dishes, and I had gone down to my workroom to regrip several of my rackets for the upcoming fall racquetball league. I had been an avid player for 7 or 8 years now, playing several mornings a week before reporting to work as an engineer at GM. I also played in at least one evening league every fall, winter, and spring session. It was a matter of pride to me that I had gotten pretty good in that relatively short period of time, and always played in the top brackets. I competed in local tournaments several times a year, usually finishing near the top. Playing racquetball consistently kept my weight at about 200 pounds spread over my 6 feet 2 inches frame. Our 7-year-old daughter, Jessie, had followed me down to watch her favorite movie in the playroom, and the baby, Allison, age 4, had followed her. Allie was at the age where Jessie couldn't go anywhere without Allie wanting to go too. Luckily for us, Jessie didn't seem to mind yet, though I was dreading the day when she got older and that would change. Our son, Jason, now 9 years old, was very much aware that he was a boy, the oldest, and shouldn't be expected to play with his little sisters. He was probably up in his room building or playing with his model planes and cars. Fortunately, Jason took after me in many ways, with brown hair, hazel eyes, a strong chin, and a prominent but not overly large nose. Jessie had Sally's red hair and delicate features, while Allie had blonde hair, and although it was early yet, she appeared to have a blend of both our features. I finally finished the grips on the 3 rackets that I kept in my gym bag, and was feeling the string tension, thinking that a couple of them could stand to be restrung. It was Murphy's Law that you could always count on a string breaking at least once a week in the middle of a league match. I looked in on the girls, and they were right in the middle of Asterisk Lady and the Tramp Asterisk, so I decided to head back upstairs. As I climbed the stairs at my stocking feet and got close to the partially open basement door, I could hear the soft murmur of Sally talking on the telephone. The thought occurred to me that maybe I could sneak up on her and get a little grab. I had thoughts of setting the mood for something later on, even though we had already gotten our usual weekend mattress time the morning before. As I approached the door, I peeked through the opening to see where she was. Perfect. I grinned in glee. Sally was leaning on her elbows on the kitchen counter, her butt clad in tight jeans pointing right at me, and holding the phone up to her ear. Her blouse was untucked and hanging loose, and I could see her bare midriff and just a hint of her bra. Her red hair was in a ponytail that bobbed up and down as she talked. Even after 3 kids and 10 years of marriage, Sally was still hot. She stood about 5 feet 6 inches and kept her weight under 130 pounds through regular exercise and eating right. Age and maturity had softened her curves somewhat, but she was sexier now than when we married. She was 23 then, and I was only a year older. The kids may have slowed down our sex life over the years, but we usually managed to eke out some time for ourselves a couple of times a week. Now, the view of that wonderful pear-shaped bum and long tapered legs was starting to give me a definite stiffening in my groin. As I slowly eased the door open wider, I could hear some of the conversation taking place on the phone. On the schedule for Tuesday and Thursday from 9 o'clock until 3 o'clock, I heard her say. There was a pause as she listened to what the other person was saying. Yeah, I can talk. Phil's down in the basement with the girls. Yep, I think so too, Debbie. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. This coming weekend, I don't think we have anything on the calendar. I could probably do it. Ah, now I know she was talking to her friend and boss, Debbie Bradshaw. It sounded like they were setting up another one of their regular weekend shopping trips that happened 3 or 4 times a year. I slowly pushed the door open further and started to step out to make a quick grab for the prize beckoning me when suddenly I stopped, puzzled by a strange sound. Sally giggled. What the hell? Then she giggled again as she listened to something Debbie was saying. What surprised me was that I couldn't remember Sally ever giggling like that since our honeymoon. Then she lowered her voice, and I could just make out, "Sure, I'd like to try that thing again before the wart comes off." Suddenly, that comment brought to mind a conversation I was part of in a bar a couple of months before. I started to feel dizzy and lightheaded. I eased back onto the basement step and slowly pulled the door almost shut behind me. As I did so, Sally continued to laugh and practically whispered into the phone. I could only make out a word here and there. Last time really had me going. I know. Yeah, both of them. Tell them we'll see. Can't wait. I stood there in the darkness of the stairwell as she started to wrap up the conversation. Suddenly, I didn't want her to know that I was there, so I turned and quietly made my way back down the stairs and staggered into my workshop. I collapsed into my chair as I thought about the conversation that I had been reminded of. It had occurred last spring after one of the last matches in our Wednesday night racquetball league. Several of us went to a bar afterward for a couple of beers, which we did about once a month. After an hour or so, there were only myself, John Harrison, and Craig Davis left. John and Craig were best friends and had joined the Oak Park I only a couple of years before. John was quite a beer drinker, but Craig was strictly a soft drink guy. Eventually, I found out he was an alcoholic and had quit drinking some years ago. From what I heard, the only part of his alcoholism that was a problem was he couldn't get it up after a couple of beers, which apparently annoyed his wife plenty. But he still enjoyed the bar scene and would join the crowd whenever there was an opportunity. Both were married. John had 2 kids, and Craig had 1. As usual, after discussing the matches for a while, the jokes and talk would turn to sex and women. After a dozen times in the bar with those 2, I had figured out that they didn't have any scruples about fooling around, and a couple of times they seemed to take an unusual interest in my marriage and my sex life, to the point that it made me uncomfortable. On at least one occasion, I had left after 1 beer just to avoid the subject. On this particular night, Craig was razzing John about his wife, Mary. She was insisting that he have a surgical procedure of a very personal nature. I thought he was talking about a vasectomy and chimed in that Sally was talking about me having it done so she could quit taking the pill, but so far, we hadn't come to an agreement. Craig just kept grinning as John got this pained look on his face. "Oh no, she wants him to have the wart removed," Craig said, practically belly laughing. Looking puzzled, I said, "I guess I'm lost. What are you talking about?" John got a little red in the face, but explained that ever since puberty, he had had an everyday garden variety wart on the top of his member, about halfway down, or about 4 inches back from the tip. This time I laughed. I had seen him in the shower, but not close enough to notice a wart. He admitted that over the last couple of years, the wart had grown some, and it was starting to freak his wife out. John was insistent that the wart served a valuable purpose when having sex in the missionary position, and with the right angle. His wart was perfectly positioned to stimulate the right places. He referred to it somewhat crudely as his pleaser. His wife, Mary, was insisting that he had to have it taken off, even if it meant she lost something in the transaction. It seemed to me John didn't object as much to his wife missing out as he objected to losing an advantage he had when going after other women. Apparently, his wart often became a topic of discussion and invited a certain amount of curiosity when trying to talk other women into bed. About that time, I decided the conversation was getting too deep for me and decided to hit the road. Now, I sat in the dark, thinking about that conversation. I just couldn't believe Sally could be involved in anything that her phone call was suggesting. Sally knew John and Craig were people I played racquetball with. I had talked about them several times before, and their names were usually on the match schedules I kept with our calendar. But as far as I knew, they had never met. However, the dots kept trying to connect themselves, no matter how much I tried to deny it. I had this sinking feeling in my gut that I was in the dark here and felt myself breaking into a sweat. I just couldn't believe that Sally would do such a thing, and was desperately hoping there was some plausible explanation. Whatever was going on, Debbie was apparently involved too. Sally's boss, Debbie Bradshaw, had become the assistant store manager where Sally worked about 5 years before. She had transferred from corporate headquarters around Detroit, where she had previously worked in the same store just after college before rotating to the big city for management training. Debbie was married to Josh, a CPA she met while working in Detroit. Sally had mentioned to me that Josh was her second husband. Sally and Debbie were around the same age and had become friendly. When Sally was pregnant with Ally, Debbie was also pregnant at the same time with their daughter, Shannon, their first, and so far only child. Both kids were born within a month of each other, which brought Debbie and Sally even closer together. We had socialized with Debbie and Josh a few times over the years, usually at some work-related event of Debbie's and Sally's. We didn't inhabit the same social circles and were probably a step down financially from their level. Debbie was a smart, beautiful, green-eyed blonde, but it always seemed to me that she needed to be the center of attention. Josh seemed to be a nice enough guy, but I always thought his primary focus was on his work. John and Craig had both joined the Racquetball League about 2 years before. John owned a construction business, and Craig was the managing partner of a residential building company, with his father-in-law as the senior partner. We were all about the same age, married, and having families, so we had a lot in common. But strangely enough, the only time we socialized was during racquetball, or the occasional beers afterward. Our families had never met. As often happens when you start hanging around with new people, you discover you have friends and acquaintances in common. One time, when I mentioned the store Sally worked for, John said he knew someone who worked there too. It turned out it was Debbie Bradshaw. Debbie had graduated from the same high school as John and Craig, but a year behind them. He mentioned that they ran into each other a couple of times a year. The shopping trips started about 2 years ago, when our youngest Ally was going through the terrible tours. For a couple of months, Sally was having a particularly hard time with Ally. Jessie was in kindergarten, so she was also home half-days. Trying to take care of 3 kids, the house, and work a couple of days a week was taking its toll on her. I wasn't much help at the time as I was working overtime every week on a project I was assigned to. It got so bad that one night, after everyone had gone to bed, she collapsed on the couch and just started sobbing out of frustration and exhaustion. I gathered her up in my arms and held her until she finally settled down. After talking about the situation, she complained that if she could just get a break from it once in a while, she might feel some relief. I felt so bad about not being able to be there as much as I should have that I offered to be solely responsible for the kids on my next weekend off if she wanted to get some time away. She tearfully thanked me and said she would think about it. A couple of weeks later, Sally said she had been talking to Debbie about needing to get away from the kids. Debbie suggested they do a shopping trip together and hit some high-end malls around the suburbs of Detroit. Debbie was sure her husband wouldn't mind. Despite my misgivings about letting her loose in some expensive mall with a credit card, I agreed. So, on my next free weekend, Sally and Debbie took off on Saturday morning for Detroit. They stopped for breakfast on the way down, then hit one of the malls in the afternoon. They checked into a motel, went to dinner, then a movie. Before she left, I insisted that she call me right after checking in and give me the phone and room number where she was staying, which she did. The next day, they checked out, had brunch, and went to another mall before finally getting home around 5 in the afternoon. Sally was so grateful for the trip. She gave me a big hug and kiss as soon as she came in the door and prattled on and on about the stores and restaurants. That night, the sex was energetic and wonderful. She hadn't gone wild shopping but did buy a couple of nice things for herself and the kids. I was pleased for her, and plus, The kids had been pretty good for me, so I really had no complaints. That had been over 2 years ago. Now, somehow, after that weekend, the shopping excursions became a regular event. Every 3 or 4 months, the two of them would take off on Saturday morning and return late Sunday afternoon. I didn't really mind it. I enjoyed my time with the kids alone, and it seemed to make Sally happy. I tried to recall if anything seemed different or had changed since the trip started. I did remember that the second time she went, she came back in a totally different frame of mind than what she had after the first trip. For some reason, she seemed moody, sad, and maybe a little on edge. I mentioned it to her that Sunday night and asked what was wrong. She said nothing was wrong, but that she had started her period, and I knew she sometimes got the blues with it. Needless to say, there wasn't any sex that night. The more I thought about it, I realized that after that first time, we never made love the night she returned or for several days afterward, but we always had sex several days before she left, and as the trips continued during the week leading up to one, Sally was always almost giddy. I hadn't thought much about it before, but now I wondered about it. I heard Sally at the top of the steps calling me. "Phil, it's time for the girls to have their baths. Can you send them up?" I just sat there, trying to get my head together. Phil, can you hear me?" I hoisted myself out of the chair and walked over to the bottom of the stairs and yelled sourly up at her, "Yeah, I heard you. I'll get them." I went into the rec room and roused the kids after some argument. After they trudged up the stairs, I wandered around, picking up stuff and putting it away, mostly just to kill time. I had to get my mind right and not let the emotions roiling around inside me show. Finally, I couldn't put it off any longer and made my way back upstairs. Sally was looking through a cookbook in the kitchen when I came through the door. She turned to me, threw her arms around my neck, and gave me a wet, sloppy kiss. Before I could react, she pulled her head back, looked me in the eyes, smiled, and said, "Something wrong, honey. You sounded put out." Feeling awkward, I mumbled something about finding a crack in one of my favorite rackets. I kept looking into her eyes, trying to see if I could detect any truth to my suspicions, but there was nothing to see. She was just Sally, the woman I loved. She laughed and kissed me again. She hesitated a moment, and then said, "Debbie called while you were downstairs. She wanted to know if we could go shopping next weekend." As she said it, her eyes narrowed, and it was like a veil fell across her eyes. As I stared at her, she blinked and looked away from my face. Instantly, I knew she was hiding something, and I thought to myself, how long has this been happening? Desperately, I tried to think of a way to postpone the trip until I could figure out something, anything. "Don't we have something planned next weekend?" I said lamely. "Nothing on the calendar," she said. "Seems like there's a VFW event Saturday night. I was thinking we should attend," I said slowly. Sally pulled away from me and looked at me appraisingly. "Phil, you know I don't like to go to those things. I don't care if Dad goes. All you guys do is talk about army stuff and drink too much. It bores me to tears. So if you want to go, just get a sitter while I'm gone. Then why don't we do something with the kids this weekend? Cedar Point is only going to be open for a few more weeks before it closes for the season, and we've never taken Ella yet. She's old enough to enjoy it now," I said, grasping at a suggestion. Sally frowned at me, and her face started to get red, like it does on the rare occasions when she really gets angry. "We just took the kids to Mackinac Island over Labor Day weekend. That was only a couple of weeks ago. What's gotten into you, Phil? You never objected to me going shopping before." Getting a little bit pissed myself, I said, stone-faced, "Never mind. I just thought maybe we could do something together. You and Debbie have a good time. I'm going upstairs to make sure the kids go to bed." I turned and headed up the stairs to the bedrooms. About halfway up, I glanced back down and saw Sally staring at me strangely. The rest of the evening, I managed to avoid any real conversation with her. Like most work nights, I went to bed before Sally and lay there trying to sleep. Sometime later, I heard her come in and go into our bathroom to change into her pajamas. She slid into bed and cuddled up against my back, wrapping her arm around me and whispering, "Phil, Phil." I kept my breathing shallow and regular, pretending to be asleep. Eventually, she gave up and rolled away from me. I could tell from her breathing when she finally fell asleep. I rolled over onto my back and stared at the ceiling, trying to sort through my thoughts. My mind drifted back, thinking about my life and how I had gotten to this point. I had grown up less than 20 miles from where we were living now, just your usual middle-class family. Mom, Dad, me, and my older sister. The most interesting thing about growing up was my best friend, Jason, or Jace, as everyone usually called him. His family lived at one end of the block, and we lived at the other. We met in about 4th grade, and had been inseparable ever since. If he wasn't at our house, I was at his. Not a week went by without one of us spending at least one night at the other's house. He was Mr. Personality, always joking, laughing, rarely taking anything seriously, and always making friends wherever he went. I was more the quiet, thoughtful type. We complimented each other. As we grew up, we played sports together, began to notice girls together, and often double-dated. While neither of us got very serious about any one girl, we both managed to lose our virginity in the last few months leading up to our senior prom. As students, neither of us was outstanding, but I usually got better grades than Jace. I did discover one thing about high school that I loved, and that was drafting. By the time I was a senior, I had taken every drafting class available, and was seriously considering becoming some kind of engineer after graduation. I decided to attend the local junior college that had an engineering technology program. It was relatively cheap and close enough to live at home and commute. Jace didn't know what he wanted to do, but he tagged along and enrolled in general studies. The biggest benefit was that it got us our student draft deferments. Then, toward the end of my freshman year, I messed up big time. Jace and I had been out at a college kegger on a Saturday night when I got pulled over on my way home. I failed the breathalyzer and spent the night in the county jail. Dad and Mom bailed me out the next morning and were justifiably pissed. After it was all said and done, I used all my savings to pay the fines, legal fees, and court costs, and I lost my driver's license for a year. I moped around until the end of the semester, hitching rides with Jace. Finally, I thought, screw this asterisk. Being broke with no driver's license gave me little incentive to go to school. The next year, I decided to roll the dice and enlist in the Army. I figured that with my drafting training, I could get an engineering-type job and avoid Vietnam. At least that's what the recruiter told me. Of course, he lied. When I told Jace my plans, he immediately decided to join me. The recruiter said we could go in on the buddy plan, and we were guaranteed to go through training together. So off we went. Basic training was a challenge but tolerable. Midway through the training, we went through a battery of aptitude tests to see what jobs we were compatible with. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, decided we could best serve the Green Machine as fire direction control specialists. The job entailed operating what the Army called the FDC computer, which was really a hopped-up calculator that computed distances, azimuths, and the amount of explosive charge needed for an artillery shell to hit a given target. After basic, we were sent to Fort Sill to learn our new trade. It wasn't a very pleasant place, but being with Jace, we managed to have some fun. But that was nothing compared to the next booby prize. We got orders for Vietnam a couple of weeks before graduation. After 15 days of leave, visiting the folks, drinking beer with our old buddies, and chasing a couple of our old girlfriends, we made the long flight to the Republic of Vietnam. After some finagling with the personnel clerks, we managed to get assigned to Battery, 2nd Battalion, 11th Artillery Brigade. It was November 1969, and Nixon had already started to draw down the troop levels as the strategy to turn over the war to the South Vietnamese was gaining traction. What a joke that was. We didn't see much action in the first 5 or 6 months. We fired a lot of missions from fire support bases all over I Corps, but only took incoming a couple of times. Up until then, the highlight of our tour was taking R&R in Bangkok, Thailand. After 15 days of women and booze, Jace and I returned to our unit, exhausted and hoping to rest up. The news that our unit had been attached to the 3rd Brigade, 101st Airborne, while we were gone didn't excite much comment. But a couple of days later, when our battery was airlifted onto a denuded hill in the middle of the deepest, darkest bush I'd ever seen since coming to Vietnam, I got a bad feeling. 4 months later, I came home on a stretcher. Jace came home in a body bag. I was pretty messed up physically and mentally from the trauma I had endured. I spent several weeks in a hospital and a couple of months in rehab. I also spent some time with a psychiatrist, trying to get my head around everything that had happened. After they pronounced me marginally fit for duty again, I was assigned back to Fort Sill to a training brigade as an assistant instructor. I didn't feel like talking much to anyone anymore, so I enrolled in some classes at the local college and spent my off-duty hours buried in drafting assignments. After a year there, I applied for an early out to go back to school. As Vietnam was winding down, so was the size of the Army. I had applied for and been accepted into an engineering tech program at the university nearest home. The Army approved my request, and I got released 5 months early after serving 2 years and 7 months. I moved back in with Mom and Dad and applied for my veterans benefits. Living at home, my needs were few. I had saved most of my money from MAM, and the education benefits and the income from a part-time job met all my expenses. Looking back, I was a typical, or maybe a stereotypical, shell-shocked, messed up Vietnam vet. The public response to the war, and those of us who fought it, combined with my injuries and the things I had seen and done, turned me into a bitter, introverted recluse. I let my hair grow and grew a beard. I slouched around in hooded sweatshirts or my old beat-up Army field jacket most of the time. Ratty jeans and worn sneakers completed my ensemble. I went to school, work, and home. I knew Mom, Dad, and my sister Terry worried about me, but I just didn't feel socially engaged anymore. I still saw a VA therapist about once a month, but it wasn't doing much for me. About once a week, I would visit Jace's parents, and we would talk about him and the good times we had together. They seemed to enjoy it, and it was the least I could do for them. One afternoon, I was sitting in the study hall of the International Center on campus. Several days a week, I had a couple of hours between classes, and I usually spent the time studying or reading. As I tried to ignore the noise of the crowd around me, a voice broke my concentration. "Mind if I sit here?" I glanced up at the person standing on the other side of the table and did a double take. She had long red hair with the perfect pale complexion only a true redhead could achieve. Inquisitive brown eyes looked into mine, waiting patiently for a response. I nervously licked my lips as I looked at her perfectly shaped red ones and wondered what they would feel like on mine. I was lost in that thought when she repeated herself. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Tongue-tied, I managed to blur out, "No, go ahead." As she put her books down and pulled a chair out to sit, I studied her out of the corner of my eye. She was probably about 7 or 8 inches shorter than my 6 feet 2 inches and looked like she weighed about 120 pounds. She was very well put together. For the next half hour, she was immersed in her books, and I pretended to be glued to mine. Every once in a while, I found myself glancing at her and admiring her looks. After about the 5th or 6th time I did it, I looked up to see her staring at me. She pointed to my field jacket and said somewhat tentatively, "Are you a veteran?" I nodded and said, "Yes." When she asked, "Vietnam?" I flinched, as the response I often got wasn't pleasant, but I simply said, "Yes," and left it at that. After a few minutes, she said brightly, "My dad is a veteran. He served in the Korean War. He was a Marine." I relaxed a little and thought maybe this wouldn't be too bad after all. Then she said, "He was even wounded." She said it like it was some kind of trivial thing. "Civilians," I thought disgustedly, but I just nodded and explained that I had been in the Army for nearly 3 years. I avoided any further mention of Vietnam. We started talking, and we chatted right up until the time she said she had to go to class. She gathered up her books, said goodbye, and went out the door. I was sorry to see her go. She was the first woman I'd really talked to since getting home. A couple of days later, I was sitting in nearly the same spot when I heard that familiar voice say, "Hey, mind if I sit here?" This time, I responded a little more coherently than the first time. I tried to lose myself in my book, but she started talking to me like we were best friends. After a bit, she paused and, blushing a little, said, "I just realized I've been babbling away, and I don't even know your name." Somewhat embarrassed, I held out my hand and said, "It's Phil Robinson." She laughed and said, "Sally Baxter, glad to meet you." It turned out that we both had a long layover between classes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Over the next couple of weeks, we would visit for most of our break. I heard most of her life story about her mom, dad, older sisters, her friends, and her career and school plans. Besides being beautiful, she was outgoing, gregarious, and personable. Her personality reminded me a lot of Jace. I found myself telling her about my family and classes, but not much else. I deflected any questions about the Army. To be honest, I preferred to listen to her. She could have read to me from the phone book, and I still would have listened. I was totally taken with her. Somehow, she managed to draw me out and got me to take an interest in something besides just school. After our second visit, I found myself shaving in the morning for the first time in weeks. After the third or fourth time, I actually went and got my hair cut and started dressing a little less sloppily. Mom noticed the change in me right away and started inquiring. I sheepishly admitted I had met someone who interested me. She teased me a little, but I could tell she was happy about it. A few weeks after we had met, I mustered up the courage to ask her for a date. She seemed pleased and immediately said yes. Like me, she was commuting from home to classes. After she agreed to let me pick her up on Friday night, she laughingly said, "Be warned, my dad can sometimes be hard on the guys that ask me out. Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked her right in the eye and said, "Sally, I think for the privilege of going out with you, the least I can do is put up with your father for a few minutes, or for a lifetime." I thought to myself. She blushed and said, "Oh, what a flatterer." I was finding out she blushed easily. On Friday night, I knocked at her door, and a woman with a warm smile answered it. Before I could even say anything, she said, "You must be Phil. We've been expecting you. Come in, please." And she took my hand and pulled me in. As she did so, she called over her shoulder, "Jack, Sally's date is here." She turned to me and said in a kindly voice, "Don't worry about Sally's father. He's really not as bad as she makes out. I'm Emily, by the way," and she shook the hand she was still holding. I was wondering how to react to all this when her father came around the corner from the kitchen. He was a big guy, about my height, but outweighed my 180 pounds by probably 30 pounds. Not fat, but solid. "I'm Jack," he said in a deep voice as he held out his hand and looked at me intently. "Phil Robinson," I answered as I shook his hand firmly. "Come into the family room, and we can talk for a few minutes while Sally is finishing up." The three of us walked through the kitchen into a comfortably decorated room with wood paneling. A television was in one corner, with a sofa and a couple of easy chairs arranged around it. One side of the room was taken up by a fireplace and hearth, with a mantel running the length of the wall. On one side of the mantel was a finished triangular wooden box with a folded American flag. On the other side was a glass-fronted wooden shadow box, a type I had seen in several PX during my Army days. They were used to display military memorabilia, unit patches, ribbons, and medals. In between, on a pedestal, sat an M1 Garand rifle with a highly polished stock and a leather sling. It looked very businesslike. Above the rifle was a framed Marine Corps flag. It was all very intimidating. Jack saw me looking at the mantle and said proudly, "I was a Marine in Korea. I would have stayed in, but I was wounded on the breakout from the perimeter, and then wounded again during the retreat from the chosen reservoir. I couldn't pass the physical after that." I nodded and said, "Yeah, Sally mentioned that. Tough times." "Sally says you're a Vietnam vet," Jack said as the three of us sat down. "I was there for a while," I said uncomfortably. "What did you do over there?" "I was a fire direction control specialist in an artillery battery, 155s, I said. He nodded in agreement. 155s are the workhorses of the artillery. "What part of Vietnam were you stationed in?" Emily chimed in. "You have to forgive Jack. He's kind of a military history buff. He follows everything about the war." "Sure, I understand," I said. "Our battery was all over." Jack looked at me like he couldn't decide if I was a real soldier or some kind of rear echelon type. But then again, the Marines never thought much of soldiers. I Corps, huh? That was Marine country. Well, the Marines had mostly been pulled out by the time I got there. Jack snorted. "Vietnamization. Nice term, meaning, take this country. It's yours now. It's not over yet," said Emily. "It's all over but the shouting," Jack insisted, looking at her. I sighed in relief as, about that time, Sally walked in. It was obvious this conversation could go on forever, and the last thing I wanted to talk about was Vietnam. We talked for a few minutes about school and what we were going to do that evening, and then we said our goodbyes and left. That night, we went to dinner and a movie. I can't say I remember much about it, as I was totally absorbed in our conversation. We held hands in the theater and sat close, with our heads almost touching. After the movie, neither of us wanted to end the evening, so we stopped at a bar for a drink. I ended up walking her up to her door just minutes before she had told her parents she would be home. As I stood there awkwardly, wanting badly to touch her and kiss her, but also afraid of blowing the evening, she took the matter out of my hands. She reached up, wrapped both her arms around my neck, and with her nose almost touching mine, looked me in the eyes, and whispered, "Thank you, Phil, for the wonderful evening." Time froze as I gazed into her deep brown eyes. I swear I could see all the way into her soul. Everything that she was, and everything she would ever be, was totally open to me. I knew at that moment I was in love with her. I put my hands around her waist and gently kissed her. From that day forward, at least a couple of times a week, we would embrace like that, with her arms around my neck, my arms holding her tight, looking into each other's eyes, hiding nothing. Reluctantly, she pulled away from me and went into the house. The very next day, I called her, and we talked on the phone for an hour. We made another date for the middle of the week, and just like that, we were exclusive. A few weeks later, when I told her I had rented a motel room for the next Saturday night, she blushed, as she often did, but then just smiled and nodded. The evening was everything I could have asked for. Neither of us was a virgin, but neither of us was very experienced either. There were a few awkward moments when she saw the scars Vietnam had left on me, but I assured her that the doctors had put everything back together, and I felt fine. As we lay together after that first time, my body still inside hers, her body still shuddering from the passion, I could feel the wetness of her tears from her face pressed tightly between my neck and my shoulders. Quietly, I said into her ear, "Sally, I love you. I know maybe you don't want to hear that yet, but I can't help it." Sally pulled her face back and looked down at me. I could see the tears glistening in her eyes, and her lips curled into a smile. "I love you too, Phil. I never knew it could be like this. I want to lie like this forever." I laughed in relief and kissed the tip of her nose. "I don't know about that, but I do know I want to do this again, and again, and again." This time, she laughed and then groaned. As I flexed myself in her, she said, "God, Phil, anything you want. Anything." For the first time since losing Jace, I felt at peace with the world, that life was going to work out, that there was a future for me with someone I loved and who loved me in return. By the time we left the motel, exhausted in the wee hours of the morning, we knew we wanted to be together for the rest of our lives. We talked about everything that night: sex, marriage, kids, where we wanted to live, what we wanted to do with our lives. While Sally was a year younger than me, she was a year ahead of me in school. She was graduating at the end of this spring, and I would graduate a year later. We decided Sally would go to work after her graduation, and we would wait to get married right after I graduated. In the meantime, I would get an apartment so we could be together until then. A week later, I took Sally home to meet my folks. My dad, Dave, was a toolmaker at GM, and my mom, Donna, was a part-time teacher's aide and had been ever since my sister and I had gotten into high school. Sally and my folks instantly fell in love with each other. Mom said later that they not only loved Sally for herself, but also for the way she had brought me out of my shell and how I had changed. I was happy. I couldn't stop smiling most of the time. I was so over the moon that the next time I saw my therapist, he kicked me out of his office and told me not to come back. Sally's dad and I continued to have a wary relationship. I'm sure he was concerned about the man who had swept his youngest daughter off her feet, and the fact that we were intimate didn't help. The look on his face when we started talking about moving in together before marriage was scary. That all changed a couple of months later after Jack and Emily had invited us over for dinner one night. Jack and I wandered into the den afterward, while Sally and her mother stayed in the kitchen, putting food away and talking. After a few minutes of small talk about the usual topics, Jack hesitated for a moment and then said, "Sally tells me you have some significant scars from Vietnam. She was asking me what could have caused them." I looked away, feeling embarrassed for some reason. "Yeah, well, it's not something I like to talk about, especially to her." Jack smiled and said, "I know what you mean. Civilians don't usually understand." After a moment he said, "Phil, you gave me the impression when we met that you didn't see much action over there." Reluctantly, I said, "I didn't really until the last firebase I was on." After a moment of silence, he asked, "Which firebase was that again?" I hesitated. "Ripcord." Jack's eyes widened. "Ripcord? You were on Ripcord?" I nodded. "Summer of '70. He asked with some intensity, "Was it summer of '70? Again, I nodded. I was somewhat surprised that he had even heard of Ripcord. The Army had done its best to minimize any news of the battle due to the high number of casualties we had incurred. It wasn't hard to do since President Nixon's Cambodian incursion was occurring at the same time. At that moment, Sally and her mom came back into the den, and we started talking about school and Sally's upcoming graduation. Jack and I never spoke about it again, but from that moment on, Jack treated me like the son he never had. After that, things started happening pretty fast. Sally graduated with honors and got a well-paying job as an assistant buyer for a retail chain store not far away. She spent as much time with me as she could in my apartment, but her mom and dad put their foot down about her moving in with me full-time. I graduated on time and had a job lined up with General Motors as a draftsman before I even had my diploma. We got married 2 months later. With both of us working, we were able to afford a small Cape Cod on a big enough lot to add on to the house if it became necessary. Within a year, our son Jason was born, named after my best friend. He was a wonder. 2 years later, we had Jesse. At that point, we thought we were done. But after some wavering, we had Allison 3 years after Jesse. It was special having a son, but it was the girls who had me wrapped around their little fingers. Sally had cut back to part-time and transferred to retail when Jason was born. She wanted to stay employed at least part-time between kids and eventually return to full-time work when all the kids were in school. Right now, she fluctuated between 12 and 20 hours a week. It worked out since she qualified for a big employee discount, and keeping the kids in clothes was expensive. My job had steadily evolved since I started. Early on, I had gotten involved in translating part designs into programs for creating numerical control tapes for automated manufacturing. By the time Allie was born, we were seeing the first computer-aided design systems starting to be developed, and the company had elected me as part of a group to be trained in the very first implementation. Life was good, money was adequate, enabling us to afford 2 cars and a modest but beautiful home. We had added a bedroom, a bath, and a finished rec room. With the kids being born, we had 3 beautiful and healthy children. We did lots of things together as a family, including at least one family vacation every year for the 5 of us. Twice a year, Sally and I would parcel out the kids to the grandparents for a long weekend somewhere, just for us. I had always thought our marriage was solid. Our sex life was frequent and varied. Sally was always a willing and enthusiastic partner, and both of us were comfortable initiating sex. We weren't shy about professing our love to each other. We cuddled, held hands, and touched each other frequently. I would look at her, and then at other guys' wives, and think how lucky I was, and I often told her so. I always thought we were just as much in love, and as hot for each other now as we were 10 years ago. Now, I wasn't so sure. I could feel my life turning. Sleep eluded me most of the night, and I probably only got a couple of hours. I skipped going to the Y the next morning and staggered into the office, closing my door and staring at the wall. I knew I had to come up with a plan, a course of action. Somehow, I needed to find out what was happening. I could ask Sally directly what was going on. She had never lied to me before, as far as I knew. But if she was already hiding something, would she tell me the truth now? And how would I know? I knew what I had overheard. I knew what I had seen in her eyes. I started doodling on a pad and made some notes on where to go from here, some steps to take to find out what was happening. But when it came to coming up with what I would do if it turned out to be the worst-case scenario, I was lost. I love Sally. I love my kids. The thought of being without them scared the hell out of me. But even scarier was the thought that maybe Sally didn't really love me. For the next few days, I was like a zombie at work and at home. I couldn't think about anything else. Sally didn't even notice until Jason said something about Dad not acting right. I just passed it off as a work project being on my mind. On Tuesday, I got back to my routine and went to play racquetball before work like I usually did. John was there, and of course, Craig. The thought occurred to me that I had never seen John without Craig or vice versa. I knew that if John was involved in something, Craig would be too. When I walked into the locker room, they were down at the end of one aisle, changing and talking quietly to one another. When they glanced up and saw me, John laughed, and Craig started smirking like he was the only one in on a joke. I now realized that his smirk was a common expression on his face. I stiffened and started to get angry. For the first time, I started thinking about the 2 of them as my adversaries. John was about an inch taller and maybe 10 pounds heavier than me. Craig was a little shorter and stockier. I usually beat them at racquetball, mostly because I had been at it longer and was in slightly better condition. I controlled myself, and about 6 of us played some pickup matches. John and Craig were cordial, and we exchanged some small talk before we all cleaned up and went to work for the day. On Wednesday, I decided to try to verify John and Craig's whereabouts on Saturday. I called John's house from work and spoke to his wife. I told her I was one of the guys from his racquetball league and was calling to see if John was available to play on Saturday. She said that, as far as she knew, he was going to a business conference in Detroit in the afternoon, returning Sunday. My heart sank when I heard that. On a hunch, I called Craig's house and got the same answer from his wife. Slowly, I hung up the phone and sat staring out the window. It was true. It had to be true. The 4 of them were hooking up down there. But the question remained, how far had it gone? Regardless, it was too far. I was angry. I started hearing a little voice in my head saying, Do something Friday night after work, I stopped at Mom and Dad's. Dad had retired this past year, and they were planning on spending the winter in Florida. In the meantime, they spent a lot of time fixing up the house, getting it ready to sell in case they found something down there they liked. They also loved taking their grandkids whenever they got a chance. I told them I needed to talk to them, and we sat at the kitchen table with some iced tea as I tried to think of a way to break it to them. Finally, I sighed and said, I don't know how to say this, so I'll just come out with it. I think Sally is cheating on me. As I said it, tears started running down my face, and I practically sobbed. It was the first time I had articulated the unthinkable out loud. Mom and Dad recoiled in shock. No, it can't be. Not Sally. Sally wouldn't do that to you. She couldn't do that to you, Mom whispered. Son, why do you think that? Dad said quietly. I went over the things I had overheard and the things I'd found out. Mom sat there quietly crying and shaking her head. Dad reached out and drew her to him, holding her tight. What do you need from us, Phil? Dad asked. I have to know for sure. I have to be there tomorrow night. I know it's a lot to ask, but can you take the kids for me tomorrow and keep them until Sunday? I pleaded. Dad nodded. Of course we will, Phil, but I pray to God. It's all a misunderstanding. I nodded. Yeah, me too, but it's hard to see how it could be. Shaking my head, I got up and left. When I got home, Sally was bouncing around, finishing up dinner. She turned around as I walked into the kitchen, threw her arms around my neck, and kissed me. The kids are in the rec room, and dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes, she said happily. I could tell her mind was already on her weekend plans. She was practically flying, like she was on speed or something. As I thought about that, it also occurred to me that we hadn't had sex since the previous Saturday. We had missed our usual midweek romp, probably because I had been in a bad mood all week and had actually taken sleeping pills a couple of times to get through the nights. But Sally had never brought it up either. I wondered what she would say to the idea. Hesitantly, I said, Honey, I just realized we haven't made love since last weekend, and you're going to be gone this weekend. How about we get the kids to bed early and make some time for ourselves tonight? Sally pulled her arms back from around my neck and stepped back a bit. Once again, I could see that veil fall across her eyes, and her smile became forced. Gee, Phil, I'd love to, but I started my period today, a little early, she said hesitantly and expressionlessly. Oh, sure, I understand. She reached up and stroked my cheek, saying, Seriously, as soon as my period is over, I'll make it up to you, I swear. Okay, was all I could do not to jerk away from her hand. Yeah, it's a date then, I mumbled. She hugged me and happily went back to fixing dinner. I turned and walked slowly up the stairs to change. Sally's periods were regular as clockwork as long as she was on the pill. It was clear to me now she was saving herself for her date tomorrow. If I hadn't known where I stood before, I knew now. The anger got stronger, and that voice saying, do something was a little louder. Getting through dinner without showing all the emotions I was feeling was difficult. The kids chattered away like they usually did, and Sally was oblivious. Could this be the last time we would all sit down to dinner as a family? I turned my head away as tears welled up in my eyes at that thought. The next day, we followed our usual Saturday routine. The older kids cleaned their rooms after breakfast. Allie would pretend to help. When they finished, they could watch cartoons. I puttered around in the garage until it was almost Sally's time to leave, then went back into the house. Sally was just coming down the stairs with her suitcase, yelling at the kids to be good while she was gone. Allie was right behind her, yelling, Buy me something. Mommy, buy me something. Sally stopped at the bottom of the stairs, dropped her suitcase, and picked Allie up, giving her a hug and a kiss. I will, sweetie. Be good for Daddy, Sally said, handing Allie over to me. She gave me a kiss and said, Gotta go. I'm supposed to pick up Debbie in 20 minutes. I nodded. Don't forget to call me as soon as you get to the hotel. Which one is it again? She laughed and said, I always do. It's the Red Roof Inn in Rochester Hills. Bye, and she was out the door. I stood on the porch, holding Ally, and watched her drive away without looking back. As soon as she was out of sight, I slowly went back inside and yelled for Jason and Jesse. I had at least 2 hours before Sally would be calling to tell me she arrived safely, more than enough time to do what I had to do. The two of them came tumbling down the stairs, chattering away, wanting to know what I wanted. I told them we were all going over to Grandma and Grandpa's to spend the night, so they needed to pack a bag with pajamas, a change of clothes, and their favorite toys. With only a little fuss, and without answering the inevitable questions, I got them turned around and back up to their rooms. I helped Ally get her stuff together, and we got everyone out of the house and in the car. Mom and Dad were waiting at the door when we pulled up. I got everyone and everything unloaded and settled into the house. As I was heading out, Dad looked troubled. Good luck, Phil. I hope you're wrong. I sighed. I know, Dad. Me too. Thanks for doing this. I'll call you in the morning. I headed home via the airport. I stopped at Avis and changed cars. I didn't want my car to be recognized where I was going. A couple of hours later, I was still sitting in the kitchen, staring at the clock. My mind kept replaying the events of the week with repetitive slowness. When the phone finally rang just after 1 o'clock, I stared stupidly at it before coming to my senses and picking it up. Is that you, Phil? I heard Sally say. Yeah, it's me. You didn't even say hello. Is everything okay? Everything okay. Everything's great, just great. Everything all set on your end. I said a little sarcastically. I don't know what you mean by all set, but we got here okay. We stopped for lunch on the way down. We are in room 168, and the number is 555-645-0168. We exchanged small talk for a few minutes, then she said, Debbie's waving at me. Gotta go. We are spending the afternoon at the Meadowbrook Village Mall. See you tomorrow. The phone clicked as she hung up without waiting for me to say goodbye. I thought to myself, asterisk, she didn't even say I love you, asterisk, and she hadn't said it this morning when she left either. I dialed the number I had previously looked up for the Red Roof Inn and asked for reservations. I asked them if Sally Robinson had checked in yet. They said yes, she had, and would I like to be connected with her room. I told them no, it wasn't necessary. I would be seeing her later. I hung up, then dialed the number again. This time, I asked if there was a John Harrison registered. They said there was, but he hadn't checked in yet. I said I would call back later and hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, trying to suppress the anger that was threatening to turn into a killing madness. It was a scary feeling I hadn't felt in many years. I got up and slowly walked down into my workshop and unlocked the door to my gun cabinet. I stood there and stared at my dad's old 16-gauge double-barrel shotgun, my Winchester Model 73, 30-06 rifle, and my old pellet gun from when I was a kid. Dad had given me his old shotgun when he and Mom planned to move before retirement last year. The Winchester I had bought while I was in high school when I had hunted deer for a couple of years. I hadn't been able to stand the thought of hunting again after Vietnam. I stood there, lost in thought. I knew if I took a gun with me, I might never see my kids again. I bent over and opened up the bottom drawer, taking out an old beat-up shoebox lodged in the corner. I carried the box upstairs and dumped it out on the kitchen table. I rooted around in the pile of stuff until I found what I was looking for. I pulled out the Marine K-bar knife I had bought in Bangkok. Felt the edge, still sharp. Most of the blade was stained a dark, rusty color. I slid it back into its sheath, bent over, and pulled up my pants leg. I strapped it to my calf and covered it back up. I collected a few things I might need: driving gloves, a water bottle, and a couple of candy bars. It was after 2 when I slid behind the wheel of the car to start the 90-minute trip to Rochester Hills. I eased into the parking lot of the Red Roof Inn and slowly drove down the length of the building until I came to room 168. I didn't see Sally's car, so I backed into a parking spot a couple of rows back from the room, turned off the car, and waited. I didn't want to, but I kept thinking and reminiscing about Sally and the kids. It was after 5 when a new red pickup I recognized pulled into a parking spot right in front of Sally's room. John and Craig got out. They looked pretty happy, laughing and talking. They pulled a couple of suitcases and a cooler out of the back and went into the room next door. About 45 minutes later, they came out and got back into the truck. I followed them for several miles until they turned into the parking lot of a bar called Tapper Pub. I stopped on the street and watched them go in. Then I slowly drove around the lot and almost instantly spotted Sally's car. I parked on the street where I could see both the front door and John's red pickup. I thought about going in, but the bar seemed kind of small, and I was afraid of being spotted. I sat there, listening to an old country music station and an endless string of sad, mournful songs. It fit my mood. It was after 9 when the 4 of them finally came out of the bar, laughing, joking, and holding hands. Instead of trying to follow them, I decided to beat them back to the hotel. At this time of night, I didn't think they would go anywhere else, and being parked where I was, I could easily get on the road before they did. I was parked back across from their rooms with my windows rolled down a good 10 minutes before both the pickup and Sally's car pulled into the lot. The 4 of them got out and stood around in front of the room, talking. I was close enough to see them clearly by the light over the door, but far enough away that I couldn't hear what they were saying except for an occasional burst of laughter. They seemed to be having a good-natured disagreement about something. After a few minutes, John made a big production of pulling a coin out of his pocket, flipping it into the air, and catching it, then holding his hand in front of everyone to reveal which side was up. There were both cheers and groans from some of the observers before Craig pulled an unresisting Sally to him and gave her a big, long kiss. Smiling, Debbie grabbed John's arm and pulled him toward the other room. Arm in arm, the 2 couples laughingly went into their separate rooms, turning to point and wave at each other. I sat there, stunned. Who was doing what to whom? What kind of game was this? As my mind wrestled with my anguish and the knowledge of what was probably going on in room 168, the voice I had heard all week in the back of my mind started building to a shout. Asterisk, do something. Anything. Asterisk, do what? It was obvious this wasn't the first time. They were too comfortable with each other. I couldn't undo what Sally had already done. 10 years of marriage and building a family. She had thrown it all away along with me. What good would it do now? I thought. I knew the answer to that. At the very least, I would sleep better knowing I tried. Then John came out of Debbie's room, dressed only in boxer shorts and a t-shirt, holding a beer. I glanced at my watch and suddenly realized I had been staring at their door for over an hour. John looked up and down the front of the building to make sure no one could see him, then strolled over to Sally's room and knocked twice on the door. A couple of minutes later, Craig came out wearing jeans, no shirt, and no shoes. He closed the door behind him. The 2 of them stood there for a few minutes talking while John sipped his beer. Then the 2 of them high-fived each other. This time, John went into Sally's room, and Craig went into Debbie's room. It suddenly dawned on me what had just happened. I went nuts. Suddenly, the voice was screaming in my head. Asterisk, do something, asterisk. I felt the rush of killing madness come over me. I could no longer stop myself. I reached over to the other seat and found my driving gloves, pulling them on. I deliberately got out of the car and quickly walked over to room 168. I put my left thumb over the peephole and knocked twice with my right hand. As the door started to open and John was saying, "What the hell, Craig?" my fist was already traveling forward and connected squarely with John's nose, all my anger and frustration behind it. John's head snapped back, and he stumbled 2 steps before going down hard on his bum. He sat there in only his boxer shorts, eyes closed, and his hands over his face, blood pouring between his fingers. He was moaning and rocking back and forth. I glanced around the room at the messed-up bed and the bathroom door ajar. I could hear the shower running. I took 2 steps forward and kicked John in the balls as hard as I could. He lifted about 2 inches off the ground and let out a high-pitched scream, falling on his side and curling into a fetal position, clutching himself. I straddled his body, knelt down, and pulled him onto his back. I pulled up my pant leg and took the knife out of its sheath. His nose was mostly on the right side of his face, blood dripping down over his chin and onto his chest. I tapped the flat of the knife on his broken nose to get his attention, then flipped it around. As he groaned and opened his eyes, they went wide when he saw the tip of the knife weaving in front of him. I grabbed a handful of hair, and he gasped as I pulled his head and chin back, laying the point of the knife under his left eye. "How long, John? How long has this been going on?" I whispered savagely as I traced the point of the knife along his cheekbone. "Don't lie to me now," I said coldly. Maybe 2 years, he stuttered, the fear evident in his voice and eyes. I thought about that for a moment as I ran the tip of the knife slowly back and forth. Then I guess joining the same racquetball league wasn't a coincidence. Was it, John? No, he said weakly as he closed his eyes in pain again. I contemplated that fact. You wanted to be close to the man whose wife you were screwing. You are one sick piece of shit, John. I roughly shook his head by his hair to get him to open his eyes again. Look at me, John. If I ever hear of you coming near Sally, or any other married woman for that matter, I will find you and cut that worthless stick off all the way down to the root. Do you understand me? Do you? I repeated as he hesitated. Yes, he finally croaked out. In fact, you'd be better off if you went away, far, far away, I said as I traced the knife point down along the side of his face to his neck and carotid artery. The knife left a thin red line. It was tempting, so tempting. John's eyes bulged in terror as he realized how close to death he was. Suddenly, the stench hit my nostrils as I realized his bowels had let go. At that moment, the sound of the shower stopped, and I heard the shower curtain get pulled back. Sally's voice floated through the door. "Hey, John boy, I thought you were going to get into the shower with me. What's up with that?" She giggled. I looked up just as the bathroom door opened, and Sally stepped into the doorway. She was holding a towel and drying her hair. When she suddenly saw me, her eyes flew open wide, and she gasped, her face turning a pasty white. The towel fell to the floor as her mouth fell open, trying to say something. Total shock was evident in every muscle. I picked up John's head by the hair, lifting it about 2 inches, and slammed it back down on the floor. I stood up in one fluid motion. He groaned and rolled back into his previous fetal position. "John boy seems indisposed." I growled at her, still holding the knife in my hand. I faced my wife in all her glory, wet and naked. The thing I noticed enraged me further. The bright splotches of whisker burn around her breasts and inner thighs, given to her by another man, and the prominent hickey slightly above her left breast. From past experience, I knew that with her complexion, those marks would last for days. That explained why she couldn't let me see her naked for several days after returning from her trips. I glared at her and took a step toward the bathroom. Her face took on a look of panic as she took a step backward, reached out with both hands, and slammed the door shut. I heard it click as she locked it. I turned and strode over to the nightstand next to the bed. I picked up the telephone, and with one swipe of the knife, cut the cord, then slipped the knife back into its sheath. I turned around and headed for the front door. As I passed John, I gave him a vicious kick in the ribs and felt a satisfying crack as he let out a sharp yelp, followed by a long, drawn-out moan. I stopped at the door and surveyed the room one more time. Suddenly, I screamed in frustration and anguish, then brought the phone up in a wicked overhand throw, and pitched it right at the bathroom with all my strength. It crashed hard into the door and clattered to the floor, eliciting a startled scream from inside. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. I paused for a moment and realized the job wasn't done yet. I walked over to the other hotel room. Again, I put my left thumb over the peephole and knocked twice with my right hand. The door opened and Craig started to say laughingly, "You guys sure are noisy," when my fist caught him under the chin. His feet went right out from under him, and he fell flat on his back. He lay there naked and unmoving. I took one quick step forward and kicked him hard in the balls. He still didn't move or make a sound. I heard a short scream from the bed and looked up at Debbie, sitting against the headboard, her eyes like saucers, holding a sheet up under her chin. I knelt down over Craig and felt his pulse. There was a trickle of blood coming out of the corner of his mouth, and his jaw hung loosely. He was alive, but out like a light. I stood up and strode over to the nightstand next to the bed. Debbie had let go of the sheet, letting it fall to her waist as she put her shaking hands over her mouth, her frightened eyes staring at me over her fingers. "Nice figure, Debbie," I commented, looking down at her. I noticed she also had a hickey, but hers was above her right breast. Oddly, I wondered if they were intentionally marking their conquests. Then I picked up the telephone and gave it a quick jerk, pulling the cord out of the wall. I walked back to the door and turned to look at her. "If you mention to your husband that you ran into me tonight, tell him I said hello," I said sarcastically. Then, changing my mind, I said, "Or maybe I'll tell him myself." I tossed the telephone into the corner of the room, then stepped out, closing the door behind me. I stood outside, looking at the night sky and deeply breathing the cool air. I could feel the tension slipping away, replaced by a calming exhaustion. The do something voice was gone. It was done, and I knew what else I had to do, the only thing I could do. Purposefully, I headed toward my car to get started on the rest of my life. "Yes," I said into the phone somewhat abruptly. I was annoyed at the interruption, even though I had been expecting it all morning. I had been deep in thought about Jason, Jesse, and Ally. They were now the most important part of my life, and figuring out how to shield them from the consequences of what had happened was now my biggest priority. "Phil, this is Jack." "Yes, Jack," I responded without enthusiasm. "What's going on there?" "Sally was here at the house when her mom and I got home from church. She's crying her eyes out and says she's afraid to go home," Jack said forcefully, nearly shouting. I looked at my watch. It was almost 1 o'clock, nearly 14 hours after I had left Rochester Hills. "I don't know what I could have done to make her feel that way," I said deadpan. "She says you got violent with a couple of friends of Debbie's. The two of them ran into you last night. Hurt them bad." "They're lucky I didn't kill them," I said sarcastically. "Phil, what the hell? That doesn't sound like you." I thought for a minute about how to respond to that statement. Finally, I just asked a question of my own. "Did Sally tell you where this altercation occurred?" "She said it was outside a restaurant down near Rochester Hills." So she was trying to spin this. Well, her family, her story. "Sally is your daughter, so I guess it must be the truth," I said slowly. There was silence on the phone, and I could sense Jack was trying to digest all this. "Phil, I'm going to bring Sally home. I want to know what's going on. We need to talk." "No problem. I wasn't planning on going anywhere," I said. Jack hung up abruptly, but not before I heard in the background, "No, Daddy, no." I sighed. She isn't going to make this easy, I thought. I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at some old photos and mementos that had been in my shoebox and working on my second beer when they pulled in. Jack strode into the kitchen, with Sally behind him, pulling at his arm. "Please, Daddy, let us work this out. Phil and I need to be alone," Sally pleaded. I stared closely at Sally. She was without makeup, her hair undone, and her eyes red and swollen. She was trembling like she had a severe case of nerves. She refused to meet my gaze as she held onto her dad's arm and tried to steer him back toward the door. but Jack refused to be steered. He planted himself in front of the kitchen table and stared at me silently. He glanced at the knife sitting on the table next to my beer. Finally, he said, "Okay, Phil, what's going on?" I looked at Sally and said mockingly, "Yeah, Sally, tell your dad what's going on." She turned to me and said fiercely, "Shut up, Phil. You and I can straighten this all out." Her voice commanded, but her eyes were pleading with me, clearly irritated that she thought this could all be fixed if only we could be alone, or that she thought she could manipulate me. I decided to be as honest as she was being deceitful. It was she who had brought her parents into this. I looked Jack dead in the eyes. It turns out Sally and her boss, Debbie, had a couple of playmates they liked to get together with when they were out of town. I found out and objected rather forcefully. I admitted, though I said it more tactfully than she deserved. Sally gasped, backed up, and sat on one of the kitchen chairs. Jack looked at me in disbelief. "No, Phil, Sally wouldn't do that." "I don't believe you." I thought about that for a moment, then turned back to Sally and said, "Take off your clothes." "What?" she said, confused. "You heard me. What's the matter? Your dad has seen you without clothes before. It won't shock him." Sally just stared at me in disbelief and didn't move. Jack shook his head, unable to believe what he was hearing. I shrugged and said, "Okay, Sally, how about this? Take off your blouse. Just the blouse. Nothing else." Again, Sally didn't move, but she had a terrified look on her face. Jack started to get angry with me. "That's enough, Phil. Now you are being cruel and disrespectful." I looked from Sally to Jack and back to Sally. I felt the anger overcoming my feelings of pain and sadness. "Cruel and disrespectful, you say? Not even clothes, Jack. I will tell you what's cruel and disrespectful. If Sally would take her clothes off, you would see what I saw last night in her hotel room. Whisker burns around her breasts and inner thighs, and a hickey above her right breast, put there by another man," I stated in a voice devoid of emotion. Jack quickly swiveled around to look at Sally. From the frightened look on her face, it was obvious I was telling the truth. Suddenly, Jack slumped in his chair as if his spine could no longer support him. His expression crumpled, and he put his face into his hands and whispered, "Oh God, this will kill your mother." Sally turned pale, and her eyes started to tear up. "Please, Daddy, don't tell Mom. We can work this out. Phil, can't we please? Phil, please," she begged. I sat silently, rearranging old photos and fiddling with the mementos from my old shoebox, remembering another time when I was hurt beyond belief. After a few minutes, Jack straightened up and wiped his eyes. He looked at me without expression. "What are you going to do, Phil?" he asked, as tears continued to run down Sally's face. "You know, at Ripcord I lost Jace, and I ended up in a hospital. Do you know I missed his funeral? I was a mess, in pain and broken, both externally and internally." I looked up into Sally's eyes, and all the pain, hurt, and anguish from the previous night nearly blinded me. "And then I met Sally," I whispered. She stifled a sob, dropped her gaze to the table, and refused to look at me. "You brought me back to the real world. You were happy and totally interested in everyone and the world around you. You were beautiful inside and out. Everything I felt I wasn't. You made me want to know you. You made me want to really live again and gave me a vision of what my life could be like. And I fell in love with you. You saved me and gave me 3 wonderful kids. For that, I will always be grateful," I said wistfully. We sat there unmoving for several minutes. Jack finally cleared his throat and said quietly, "What now, Phil?" Wearily, I turned my head and looked at him. "Jack, I have been betrayed twice in my life. Both times I lost my best friend," I stated simply. Sally dropped her face into her hands and started weeping, whispering, "No, no, no." The 3 of us sat there quietly, Sally sobbing, both Jack and I with tears in our eyes. Jack said quietly, "Are you sure, Phil? Do you want to throw everything away on a single mistake?" Sally looked up with a glimmer of desperate hope in her eyes. I knew what I had to say would put a stake through our marriage, but I couldn't let the lie stand. I shook my head and looked at him. A single mistake, Jack? It wasn't a single mistake. I found out last night that Sally has been cheating on me for nearly 2 years, and it was with more than one man. Sally gasped, closed her eyes, shook her head in despair, and slumped back into her chair, even paler than before. I looked at her curiously. John didn't tell you, Sally, that he confessed to everything. I turned to Jack. Does that answer your question? I said. Jack slowly stood up and looked at Sally sadly. You're my daughter, and I have to love you, but I have lost all respect for you. Your behavior is... Jack stopped, at a loss for words, and just shook his head. Sally reached toward him with one hand, wanting to touch him, but he pulled away. He turned to me and said firmly, Phil, you didn't deserve this. You do what you have to do, but please don't hurt her. I couldn't sit still for that. No, Jack, I'm pretty much past that, I said sadly. But if it makes you feel better, take this with you. I slipped the knife back into its sheath and handed it to him silently. Jack accepted it and turned towards the door, shoulders slumped, no doubt wondering how he was going to tell Emily. As the door closed behind him, the phone rang, but neither of us even looked at it. We just sat there, not moving, not speaking, and not looking at each other. The ringing finally stopped, making the silence even more deafening. Finally, I said, staring off into space, I expected the cops to show up this morning with you, not your father. Sally winced at that and said, stumblingly, we had Debbie and I convinced them to make up a story about being assaulted outside a bar. We hoped if they kept it quiet, you wouldn't call their wives. I thought about that for a moment and realized I was home free. There was no way they could change their story now and be believed for a second. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders until I remembered that everything else was crashing all around me. I just grunted and said, so where are they now? Sally cleared her throat and fidgeted in her chair. They're still in the hospital for observation. You hurt them bad. John has a broken nose, cheekbone, and ribs. Craig has a dislocated jaw, a couple of broken teeth, and a concussion. I said bluntly, don't forget what I did to them down there, Sally. Sally looked up at me, some fear and trepidation in her eyes. No, you did them some serious damage down there. She hesitated for a moment. I never knew you to be violent. Phil, did you have to do that? I looked at her in disbelief. Are you defending those a-holes? I said sarcastically. Before she could answer, the phone rang again. You should answer that. It's probably for you, I said, and got up to walk to the bathroom. I washed my face and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and swollen. I looked like I felt, old and haggard, older than my age. It had been a mostly sleepless night. I wandered back into the kitchen. Sally was just standing there, looking at the phone in her hand. Slowly, she hung it up and collapsed back into one of the kitchen chairs. As I sat back down, she said without looking at me, Did you have to tell Debbie's husband? I shrugged and said, Why shouldn't I? Share the pain. He's already called John and Craig's wives, and he kicked Debbie out of the house. She's going to have to hire a lawyer just to see her own daughter. She started crying again and mumbling. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, and she fired me. She said everything was my fault. I laughed bitterly. Oh, that's just great. Tell me, Sally, just who introduced you to John and Craig, anyway? It was Debbie, wasn't it? In between sniffling, Sally said, How did you know? You know, when I told Josh this morning what you and Debbie were up to last night, he didn't want to believe me. He called me a liar and accused me of trying to break up his marriage. But as soon as I mentioned John Harrison's name, he changed his tune. He turned pale as a ghost and started swearing like a sailor. I think it was probably the first time he ever got mad in his life. You told me years ago that this was Debbie's second marriage, and she was estranged from her parents. It seems that Debbie has a sister who lives upstate that she never sees either. About a year ago, Josh was doing an audit of a company up there, And one of the people he worked with turned out to be Sarah, Debbie's sister. Sarah had known Debbie had married again, and Josh knew Debbie had a sister, but they had never met. Anyway, they hit it off, and one night, before he finished the audit, Sarah invited him to have dinner with her and Dave, her husband. She had quite a story to tell. It seems that her husband, Dave, had been Debbie's first husband. Dave and Debbie started dating in college. They dated for 2 years until Debbie graduated, and then they got married. About on their 1-year anniversary, Dave found out Debbie was having an affair. He also found out that Debbie had been cheating on him for their entire relationship. He threw her out and filed for divorce. Debbie and her parents had a falling out over it too. Then Dave and Sarah became an item, and they ended up getting married. They have a couple of kids now and seem very happy. Of course, Debbie had never told Josh about any of this. And guess who Debbie was having an affair with during her first marriage? Surprise, it was John Harrison. I stopped, and Sally just stared at me in shock. Oh yeah, so when I mentioned John's name, Josh started putting together bits and pieces of things and realized Debbie had been doing to him what you did to me for their entire marriage. No wonder he kicked her to the street. And like Josh, I wonder just how long you have been screwing around on me, I said vehemently. Sally started crying again and said, "Oh God, Phil, it was just John and Craig, and only on our shopping trips. Please believe me, I never even thought about someone else until Debbie started talking about it before our first shopping trip." She sat there, twisting a handkerchief in her fingers, alternating between crying and pleading. "Please, Phil, I don't know how I got where I am now. I felt like I woke up from a dream, or maybe a nightmare, when I opened that bathroom door and saw you standing there." I didn't say anything, just looked at her grimly. Encouraged, she started talking fast, almost babbling. I knew Debbie liked to play around. Back before we even started our shopping trips, she talked about it like it was the most fun she ever had during her marriage. But I didn't expect her to hook up with anyone on her trip. I was totally surprised when John showed up at the restaurant and Debbie introduced him to me. She explained that she knew John from back in high school and that he just happened to be in the area. I suspected that wasn't true but didn't say anything. She paused, bit her lip, and looked away. John was at his charming best that night, flirting, dancing with both of us, and complimenting me a lot. I had a couple more drinks than I was used to, and when his hands wandered a little out on the dance floor, I pretended not to notice. Later, when we returned to the hotel, Debbie went with John. He had booked the room next to ours. I knew then that Debbie had set this up. The hotel we were in was an older one with thin walls. I could hear them having sex most of the night. Debbie was quite vocal. Listening to them really got me going. "I guess that explains why you were so horny when you got home that Sunday, doesn't it?" I said disgustedly. Sally hung her head and nodded. She wiped her eyes and continued. John was gone the next morning. We went to breakfast, and Debbie gave me a blow-by-blow account of their night together. She raved about him all the way home. Over the next few months, as usual, Debbie and I had lunch together a couple of times a week. At work, she would often mention John and how much fun she had been with him, and how great the sex was. That was when I first heard about his wart. Debbie laughingly told me I had to try it out once because she couldn't explain it. At first, I just laughed it off. But the more she talked about it, the more the idea stuck in my mind. A few months later, when the next opportunity to go shopping came around, Debbie confided that John was really interested in being with me, and she wouldn't mind if I wanted to be with him. I kind of laughed it off, but asked her what she would do if I did. She said that John had a friend, Craig, who would come along and keep her company. I didn't say no, and I don't know why. I told her I would think about it, but I didn't think I could do it. Sally looked at me, and I just stared back at her without expression. I knew it was wrong, Phil, but the idea got into my head that I could do this, and no one would know, she said. Sally looked away again and said, "That Saturday night, John and Craig showed up at the restaurant. We had dinner and a few drinks. then went to a nightclub. We kind of paired off, and I was with John. By that time, I had had enough to drink and had convinced myself that nothing bad would come of it. Everyone was having a great time. Later, when we went back to the motel, John and I just naturally went to our room, and Debbie and Craig went to theirs. Sally stopped talking and just stared at her hands. Finally, I said with contempt, "So, was it everything you thought it would be?" Sally looked at me with tears in her eyes. "It was okay. It wasn't any better than what you and I have. What made it so hot was that it was so wrong, and it was with someone new. I could pretend to be someone else." "What you're saying is it was better than okay," I said bitterly. "He got you off so much you forgot about your husband waiting at home. Your husband who was taking care of your kids out of love for you, so you could have that time alone." Sally choked back a sob and looked away again. "Yes," she whispered. "And how do you explain Craig, wife of mine?" I said sarcastically. Without looking at me, she said, "After a couple of trips sleeping with John, Debbie joked she was starting to miss him. I didn't think too much about it, but on the next trip, when we paired off, I ended up dancing most of the night with Craig." Later, at the motel, Craig came to my room, and he and I spent the night together. It didn't seem like a big deal then. A couple of trips later, John and Craig switched in the middle of the night. I didn't realize it at first until late at night when I woke up and realized the man making love to me wasn't the man who I started with. Sally looked at me with sadness. It seemed like I was two different people living in two different worlds. I love our life together. You, me, and the kids, but I was hooked on those weekends away. I thought I could have both, and you would never find out. How stupid could I be? "Damn stupid," I said in agreement. "Then, after you saw me in the motel, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized what I had become," she whispered almost to herself. I stood up and looked down at her. "Interesting story, Sally. Too bad it doesn't have a happy ending, or maybe it does for you. I'm going after the kids tonight. After Allie goes to sleep, you and I will sit down with Jason and Jesse and tell them their parents are going to live apart. I think Allie is too young to understand yet. We won't tell them the real reason why, and I will do everything in my power to minimize the trauma to them. I'll sleep on the couch in the basement until I can make other arrangements." Sally screamed at me as I started to walk away. "Phil, my God, it was a mistake. I love you. Don't do this, please." I turned and said, "And why shouldn't I?" Sally, weeping uncontrollably, said, "It was only 3 or 4 nights a year. I never saw John and Craig or anyone outside of those weekends. Please, Phil, I'm begging you. Can't you forgive me and let me make it right?" "Forgive you?" I said with sadness. "Forgive you for 3 or 4 nights a year becoming a 304 for other men. For giving away what I cherish most in the world, yourself. Forgive you for destroying my trust in you. Forgive you for destroying my belief that you and I belong to each other and no one else. And how would you make it right? Can you go back in time and start over? This time, can you not screw John and not screw Craig? Because that's what it would take to make it right," I said tiredly. I stood there silently, looking around the kitchen, family photos on the wall, the kids' pictures and papers stuck on the refrigerator, Allie's booster seat in the corner, everything that made this house a home. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I spent most of last night awake, asking myself how I would feel about you in 6 months, in a year, or in 5 years. I'm sure someday I will be able to forgive you. What I can't do is ever forget. Not in a year, nor 5 years, or even 10. Every time I see you, I will think of last night. Every time I hear your voice, I will think of last night. And every time I hear your name mentioned, I will remember last night," I said with a catch in my voice, tears in my eyes. "That, Sally, is what I can't live with." I stood there, not moving, thinking sadly about the future, barely aware of Sally rocking back and forth in her chair, alternately sobbing and crying. "No, please, God, no." After a few minutes, I said softly, "Can you answer me one question, Sally?" She looked up at me with empty eyes, like a condemned prisoner who knew there would be no commutation. You lost the man who loved you most in the world. You lost the respect of your parents, the respect of my parents, and the respect of your husband. You lost your job. And someday you will have to explain to our children why you broke up our family. Was it worth it? After a minute of silence, broken only by Sally's muted sobs, I turned and slowly walked out the door. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.